What's up, Dragon Brood? Now that we're 2 weeks completed, going into the third week, I guess technically, of the set release for Edge of Eternities, we've kind of got an established metagame at this point. So what we're going to do today, since a lot of people have asked about this over the last week, we're going to go over the 8, I guess, highest win rate things in Standard, in Best of 1, and we're going to talk about cards that are good against them and ways to mitigate those strategies. Actually, you know what? Before we get into the video, I do want to say that some of the things I'm going to talk about, if you're a more experienced player, might seem obvious to you. And if so, great. But there's going to be a lot of people that do need this information. We see it in the Discord. We see people talk about it. We see it in the comments. But hopefully you find this information useful and maybe there's something for you in here, regardless of how long you've been playing the game. Anyway, let's get to those strategies. All right, so the first one we want to tackle is graveyard strategies. And this can include a lot of things, whether it's Dinosaur Reanimator, Una stuff, putting things in the graveyard so you can get enchantments back. I mean, it could be near Delirium qualifies for this, right? Anything that cares about using the graveyard. This is going to be pretty simple. Like, it seems obvious, but I see a lot of decks just not putting in enough anti-graveyard strategies. But don't just shoehorn stuff in, play the cards that actually make sense for the type of deck that you're playing. For instance, if you're playing white, then you can get away with something like Rest in Peace if you don't care about graveyards at all, right? Yours doesn't matter, so you just play it and it keeps things out of the graveyard. But maybe you want to play Leyline of the Void because you play black. Great. You want your graveyard, but you don't want them to have theirs. That's another thing. So if you're playing, say, Orzhov, maybe it's the sacrifice deck or whatever. Okay, you can still use your graveyard, but they can't. If neither of those is accessible to you, then maybe you want to play something like the Vacuum, right? It has long-term value because late in the game you can turn those into actual creatures, which is nice if you're removing your own stuff, assuming you have creatures. But you can also use it as a way to respond to whatever your opponent's doing. You don't have to just take something to take something. You can wait, let them waste a card, and then remove the card before it actually gets reanimated. Continuing on, we have stuff that's actually pretty versatile, like Heritage Reclamation, where you can use it against artifacts and enchantments, but again, you can have it as a surprise removal for a graveyard option if they go to target something, and you get a card for your troubles. And then we have the trifecta of creatures in green that can be used for a variety of different things. If you need multicolor mana, then great, go with something like Paleontologist because it'll still generate mana, especially if you're even playing a ramp deck, but it can also remove stuff from the graveyard. It does cost 2, so it's more expensive than the other options, but it gives you that option. Then you have Scavenging Ooze. Now, you need to be heavily invested in green to use the Scavenging Ooze, but if you are, or you care about +1/+1 counters, then this is the obvious answer for you. And if neither of those things work for you, well, there's Keen-Eyed Curator. Just for 1 mana of any color, you can remove stuff from the graveyard, and then eventually have a big 7/7 fighter, which is great. But it is double green to get it onto the battlefield, so that's something to consider as well. But all told, there are a lot of options you can use against graveyard stuff. I would dedicate usually 4 to 5 slots in my decks for those, but again, you want them to work with the deck, not just target those graveyard options. Because the thing is, if you are attacking just the graveyard strategies and you don't run up against one, well, now you have a card that doesn't do anything. So try to make it a card that actually does something with the deck that you're playing. There seems to be a lot of consternation around synthesizer decks as well. So let's talk about this from 2 angles. One, some of the cards you can play against it. The other being strategies that work against it. The obvious thing is play things that destroy artifacts, but again, try to go for some of your more versatile options. So just how we mentioned Heritage Reclamation a second ago, that's a perfect card for this, right? It can get rid of artifacts, but also gives you other options if you need it in other matchups. So there's going to be very few situations where you can't use this card. So if you don't need to be so creature dense, let's say you're playing mono green aggro or something, then okay, maybe this is an option where you can play Heritage Reclamation. Otherwise, you just play something like Sharpshooter or whatever, and just take down your opponent's artifacts. Yeah, you give them a card, but you just get to keep fighting with the 4/4. But another option I like is something like a Braid, right? Where it can get rid of an artifact, but still can be used to get rid of a creature. And there are a lot of aggro creature decks, which we'll talk about later in the video, that this card will still work great against. So you don't necessarily have to give up an option against the aggro decks to be able to deal with a problem like Synthesizer. And a card that's becoming popular that I'm seeing quite a bit is Exercise. You can kill a big creature with it, but you can also use it against artifacts or enchantments. Now, the difference here is that it is sorcery speed compared to some of the other options we've spoken about so far in the video, but that's okay, right? The versatility is why you're playing it. But the other thing too is you need to not waste these cards, right? You only have again, a handful of them in your list. You aren't going to go hog wild and play a whole bunch of anti-artifact stuff for one deck in the metagame. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So you need to be very strategic about how you use those. You're really only targeting 2 cards most of the time. It's either the synthesizer itself or the repurposing bay. That's it. Now, if you're in a situation where maybe they have one of your cards locked down under an artifact and you can get rid of it, and it gives you the chance to just attack for lethal the next turn, then sure, you do that. But otherwise, you hold on to these things like they're gold, and you just target the actual problem cards. Because in those matchups, they can get a whole bunch of things. Maybe get a couple of 1/1 tokens that are eventually like 2/2s. Or maybe they're just removing a couple of things and they're just trying to draw into better cards. You don't really care about those other things. Like even the 3/4 flyer with affinity, you can survive that for a couple of hits. But you need to get rid of the 2 problematic cards that let them run away with the game. When it comes to the is it Vivv decks, there's kind of 2 angles here. One is pretty obvious. You're worrying about really just 2 cards in that matchup. You're worried about Vivv because that's the obvious problem card. It's the whole reason they're playing it. And then the Planisphere, because those are the only 2 real threats those decks are playing these days. Yeah, sure, they have like otters and stuff, but you don't really care about those that much unless they string 4 or 5 spells off in a turn. And honestly, if they do that and they had almost any creature on the battlefield, it's probably going to be an issue for you. But I think something that goes neglected a lot of times in those matchups is you can actually still target their graveyard effectively. Because they are trying to reuse the caretaker, not the care, the otter's talent, sorcerer's talent, whatever it is, the blue one, right? To get stuff out of the graveyard, which makes sense, right? Long term, they have the mana, you're getting the mana from Vivv, it makes sense. But also, a lot of them are playing Agatha Soul Cauldron to be able to turn their other creatures technically into Vivvs and just have an infinite turn. These decks have even evolved to playing multiple cards that they can replay out of the graveyard. So you sometimes just go, you know what, let's just get rid of the graveyard just to save time. Or if you do have something like the vacuum in play, you just over time just pick off stuff, key cards in their graveyard so they just can't reuse those later. Those things will generally help you win those matches more than you're probably winning now. Now we're getting into some of the more aggressive decks, and the most popular one you probably see these days is the Grul, actually not Grul, mono green landfall deck. There are some Grul variants, but it's mostly the mono green one that keeps popping up. And really, there's kind of just 3 cards you're worried about for the most part in these decks. Well, technically a 4th. The 2 main creatures you're worried about are Tifa, obviously because Tifa just doubling the power, only needs to double like 3 times sometimes, and that's enough to finish a game off because of the trample. And then Mossborn Hydra. Though Mossborn Hydra is a little bit slower and can take a little bit longer to build up for a big attack, still something you have to pay attention to. So you're really just targeting 2 cards. Yeah, Bristly Bill's annoying, and so is the early Chocobo, but you can chump block those for a long time if they don't have trample. Speaking of which, 2 of the other cards you're worried about playing around is 1, Overprotect, because that's a problem if something has trample and +3, or even doubling the power or on Tifa after it's gotten a +3 can be an issue, and playing around Snakeskin Veil. And Overprotect can also protect a creature, so these sort of fall into the same category. The thing you end up having to do a lot with these decks is force them to use those cards on their end step, right? If you think you can kill it, try to kill it on their turn instead of when they try to attack. I've seen people make that mistake way too often. If you can get them to waste the card on their turn, then there's a chance you can get something else off on your turn later, or even just keep them from trampling over, possibly. And at the very least, you're forcing them to use a combat trick on their turn. They don't get the option to use it when they're in the attack step or trying to come over for lethal. And if you're going to attempt to kill something, it's a little tough if they have mana open. So if you can catch them with mana down, that's the way you want to go. Especially if they've just, say, cracked a fetch land to go search for a forest. While that ability is still in the stack, then you try to take something out, because then they don't have the 1 or 2 mana up they need to protect their creature. Again, this might seem obvious, but these are things I've watched people make mistakes on hundreds of times over the last few weeks. Well, maybe not hundreds, but at least tens of times. The Lifegame decks kind of fall in a similar category here because they don't have a lot of cards you're really worried about. It's generally going to be a Johnny's Pridemate, the Essence Channeler, and Exemplar of Light. And if you're given a choice, realistically, the Exemplar of Light is the biggest of the problems, because it can just draw cards, sometimes on your turn and their turn, in various setups. So that can allow you to fall behind pretty quickly. But the other two, you kind of don't care about that much if you have a way to generate tokens or blockers or just buy time. If you can get their flyers out of the way, or you can just force them into blocking scenarios, then like you can eventually just get past those because their other creatures aren't particularly good. They're just 1/2s and 1/1s that don't really do anything without those other creatures on the battlefield. And yeah, the legend that lets you gain life whenever you attack, like that's fine, but at some point they're just going to have large creatures that can't do anything. But if you get those out of the way, you take away their blocking options, and that's usually pretty good in those matchups. But again, I think Exemplar of Light gets a little bit, I don't know, undervalued by the opposition just because it doesn't come out early, but it's a really powerful card that a lot of those decks are starting to adapt and play more of. And I will say, Essence Channeler gets a upgrade over priority if they have a way to lose life. So eventually, they just make it really large, and then they take pain from a land or something and come over the top. Though most of the decks I'm seeing have been playing just mono white, so they don't really have a way to take damage. So you can kind of just chump block those all day, depending on the scenario. Yeah, and the strategies against the mono red aggro decks kind of fall in the space of a little bit how you would play against the mono green landfall list, and a little bit about how you would play against the Lifegame decks. In the sense that there's really only a couple of creatures that you're worried about targeting, right? The Emberheart Challenger, because, well, it does get larger with spells, and eventually they can trample over and make your blocks bad, but it also draws them extra spells to play. You have the Slick Shot, which is kind of annoying, but it usually doesn't do a whole lot if you can find a flyer or two to block it, which is kind of nice. And of course, Screaming Nemesis, because it just makes blocking situations bad later. But those are the only three cards you really need to waste removal on. Like, do I have a problem with the early lizard that's going to ping me every turn? Yeah, I don't like it, but I don't necessarily need to waste removal on it. I would rather wait and see what else I could kill, right? Now, if they decide to just call your bluff and like they just attack and they're going to risk pumping, then like sure, you go ahead and kill it and you get a whole turn ahead by killing their creature before they get the counter, and that's fine. But there are several scenarios where you kind of just say, all right, I'm going to have to take this damage from this card, but I need to kill the better creatures. Don't prioritize trying to kill every single thing in the red decks. A lot of times you're just not going to be able to. You have to kill the more problematic cards while setting yourself up, hopefully before you're below 6 life, so they have to spend at least 2 or 3 cards to try to finish you off at the end. The Rabbits deck is still popping up and putting up a reasonable win percentage in best of one, so I am going to mention it here, even though some people will be like, I don't see that deck very much. Like, I don't know, man. It's put up enough numbers and it's got results, so I don't know which one to tell you. But anyway, again, I think this is pretty obvious. There's just a couple of cards you're worried about in this deck. It's the Valley Might Caller and the Beauregard Mentor. Those are like the two real cards you're concerned about, mostly because they have trample. Everything else you can kind of deal with or manage on some level. Even their creature that pumps up their team and lets them surveil is good, but you can deal with the other cards. Like, they're a nuisance, but these are the real problems that put the game away most of the time. And then, I guess, to a secondary priority, you can worry about Phineas, because again, it pumps the team, usually just once, because then you can just block Phineas. But sometimes that +1 is super annoying. And then they have Warren Guard War Leader. Wow, I don't know why it's so hard to say. But that's actually a problem later in the game, which you can usually deal with. But I would prioritize killing the first 2 cards more than anything else. If you're going to waste removal or you have a judgment call, you're going to be better off getting rid of those things. And those decks also don't play anything to deal with flyers, and it doesn't block very well a lot of times. The deck, not any individual creature. So if you do have things with trample or whatever, yeah, just get 1 or 2 of those things in at a time and force them to deal with stuff. Once you get into a situation where you're trading cards with that deck, if they don't have one of their big creatures, the deck doesn't really do a whole lot. It's pretty linear, so that's something to keep in mind. And then I put control decks into its own category, whether we're talking about Azorius control, Dimir control, Esper control, Jeskai control. They're all kind of doing the same thing. They're wanting to play the long game, sweep the board, spot kill a few things, draw some cards, and then at some point be able to put down their 1 or 2 big creatures so they can finish you off. Or, I guess in some strategies, just mill you out, right? So, here's the thing. I made a whole set of notes that we can go over for dealing with control decks, because I think a lot of newer players just are playing incorrectly to even give themselves a chance. So here's the thing. You start by not overcommitting. If you don't have to play 5 creatures, don't put 5 creatures out. Like, a lot of times, especially if you have a couple of creatures that are already like 3 power, and your opponent's already at 10 or 12, then great. It might take you one more attack step, but it's not worth playing that other creature a lot of times if there's a good chance they're going to hit 4 mana or 5 mana the next turn and be able to sweep the board. It's just worth risking having to attack the extra turn, because especially if you have nothing else in hand that can follow up. Now, if you have a handful of creatures and you're playing your 5th creature, but you can still play 2 down the next turn, then I guess sure, go for it, because you'll be able to follow up with a threat. But if your hand is land, something, and maybe 1 creature, then it's just not worth doing. Give yourself some options post-sweeper. And honestly, even better, haste creatures work great for that. You can sit on the haste creature and then follow up with that, so you're just continuing the attack step and your opponent doesn't really get a chance to breathe. Anytime you can play stuff during your opponent's end step in the control matchup, that's going to help you out as well, whether that's drawing cards, getting rid of one of their enchantments, returning something from a graveyard, whatever it is you can do at instant speed, try to do it on your opponent's turn. Because then if they have to use counter spells or react to you with creature removal or whatever, they're going to be tapped down on their turn, so you get more free reign to do what you need to do on your turn. And if your deck really struggles with control decks, having a handful of non-creature threats is actually really good. Whether we're talking about the restless lands or any land that turns into a creature for that matter. So that way, after a sweeper happens, you just fire up a land and keep attacking. Obviously, vehicles work well for this as well, assuming that you have some way to actually crew those vehicles. So you don't want something that has like a 5 crew cost, but if it's 2 or 3, sure. Or in the case of where you're playing like World Wagon, but a bunch of creatures already have 4 power, then you're guaranteeing yourself that you get 1 creature, great, you can crew up and you can still attack. And then the obvious choice is you can always play 1 or 2 planeswalkers in your deck. That way you can just get extra cards, get extra creatures, wherever the case is, every turn, even though they are dealing with the other creature threats. So it allows you to keep putting pressure while forcing them to find kind of an off card to deal with your planeswalker that they probably don't have a lot of. And then if you don't want any of those options, you can actually just play cards to protect your creatures, which can work against other decks like mono black and things that play a lot of spot removal, even against the red decks. But a Snakeskin Veil, Overprotect, even Reroute Systems is one of the new cards that I think gives something hexproof and has some other option on it. Anything like that that's 1 or 2 mana can allow you to still do what you need to do and still save your creatures. Especially in a lot of cases if you're able to give something indestructible, because that'll protect you against things like Day of Judgment. Whew, okay, I think we covered a lot there. I don't know if this feels like this went longer than I wanted it to, but there's a lot of information to cover. So hopefully, if you're newer to the game, or maybe you've been playing for a minute and you're just curious how to play against these decks, this is a little bit of a departure from what we did last week, but I think every week just doing a format update isn't going to be good enough, because like some things just don't change that much week to week. So I don't know, do you like this type of video? Let me know. These are type of things I think could help people out, and nobody else is really making these videos. So yeah, let me hear it. Or if there's something else you want to know that we can make videos about next week, yeah, go for it. Otherwise, that's all I have you for now. We'll see you next time. After you like and subscribe and all that good stuff, because you need to do that too so you don't miss future ones.